Hello students, welcome to this lecture on the course Principles of Political Science. Today's lecture on behavioral and post-behavioral approach in political science. Today we move into a closely related but distinct area for what we have covered in our previous lecture, where we compared the two methods, normative and empirical. Today we are closely related to the previous lecture, but it is a distinct area, the behavioral and the post-behavioral approaches. These are not simply methods in the narrow sense, but broader intellectual movements, orientations towards what political science should study, how it should study it, and what it should ultimately be for. Understanding them helps us see how the discipline transformed itself in the 20th century and how it continues to evolve. The behavioral approach, which emerged forcefully in the 1950s, represented a revolution in how political science understood itself. The post-behavioral approach, which emerged from the 1950s, 60s onwards, was a correction to that revolution, an effort to retain its scientific gains while restoring the discipline's connection to social relevance and human values. Here is our agenda for today. We will define the behavioral approach, study its key aspects, trace its historical evolution or development, examine its key thinkers, and assess its importance and limitation. Before defining the behavioral approach specifically, it is important to understand why new approaches became necessary in political science in the early 20th century. As we saw in lecture 12, the empirical method had been developing since the 19th century, and the behavioral revolution of the 50s was in many ways its culmination. But why did scholars feel the need to go beyond the earlier empirical tradition? The answer lies in the perceived limitation of what is sometimes called the traditional approach in political science, the approach that dominated the discipline before the behavioral revolution. Traditional political science focused primarily on the formal, legal, and institutional aspects of politics. It studied constitutions, laws, government structures, and formal political procedures. It described political institutions in detail, but paid little or relatively little attention to how these institutions actually worked in practice, how political actors actually behaved, or what actually determined political outcomes. Critics of the traditional approach argued that it was too legalistic and formalistic, more interested in what the law said about how government should work than in what actually happened in political life. The behavioral approach emerged as a direct response, promising a scientific political science capable of explaining why political actors behave as they do, not merely describing formal political institutions. The behavioral approach in political science refers to the orientation that makes the observable behavior of individual political actors the primary object of political inquiry. The word behavior here is used in the social scientific sense. It refers to the observable, measurable actions and orientations of political actors, including voters, legislators, political leaders, bureaucrats, and interest group representatives. The key insight of the behavioral approach is that politics is ultimately made by the people, by individual human beings who think, feel, believe, and act in specific ways. To understand politics, therefore, we must understand the political behavior of these individuals. We must study what people actually do politically, how they vote, how do they vote, what parties they support, what political beliefs they hold, how they respond to political events and messages, and under what conditions they participate in political life or withdraw from it. This focus on individual behavior marked a significant shift from traditional approach, which tended to focus on formal institutions and legal structures rather than on the actual behavior of political actors. So behavioral approach drew heavily on the methods of psychology and sociology to study the specifically political dimension of human action, making it distinctly multidisciplinary and scientific in orientation that transformed political science in the mid of 20th century. One can also say that it made political science largely anthropocentric, that is, man at the center of studies. The behavioral approach is characterized by several key features that distinguish it from both normative and earlier institutional approach. The first is commitment to the scientific method. Behavioralists argued that political science should adopt the same rigorous scientific standards used in the natural science and in more advanced social sciences like psychology and sociology. The commitment to science expressed itself in several specific methodological demands. First, political claims should be based on empirical evidence, on systematic observation of actual political behavior, rather than on philosophical arguments or normative assumptions. Second, research should be designed so that its conclusions can be independently verified and replicated by the other researchers. Third, research should aim at building general theories, propositions that apply not just to a single case, but to a broad class of theories, propositions, to a broad class of political phenomena across different contexts. The second major feature is the emphasis on quantitative methods and data. Behavioralists were pioneers in the use of survey research, statistical analysis, and systematic data collection in political science. They recognized that the political opinion and behaviors of large populations could only be studied reliably through representative surveys, and that the patterns within those surveys could only be detected and analyzed through statistical methods. The fourth feature of the behavioral approach is its interdisciplinary character. Behavioralists actively drew on psychology, sociology, anthropology, economics to enrich the study of political behavior. They imported concepts, theories, and research methods from these adjacent disciplines and applied them to political questions. From psychology, they borrowed concepts like attitude formation, cognitive consistencies, personality structure, and group dynamics to explain individual political orientations and behaviors. The idea that voters form strong psychological attachments to political parties, the concept of party identification developed by the Michigan School, drew explicitly on psychological theories of social identity and attachment. From sociology, behavioralists borrowed structural concepts, social class, group membership, community networks, and institutional norms to explain how social positions and social environments shaped political behavior. The findings that people's voting decisions were powerfully shaped by these social groups they belonged to, churches, union, ethnic communities, and neighborhoods, was a central insight of the Columbia School of Political Sociology. The fifth feature is behavioralism's focus on explanation rather than mere description. Earlier institutional approaches describe political systems in considerable detail. Behavioralists wanted to go further to explain why political actors behaved as they did. The historical development of the behavioral approach in political science is closely tied to intellectual and institutional context of mid-20th century America. Several factors converged in the 1940s and 50s to make the United States the birthplace and principal home of the behavioralist movement. First, there was the influence of European scholars who fled to the United States during and after the Second World War. Many of these scholars, psychologists, sociologists, and political scientists brought with them intellectual traditions that were more scientifically oriented than the dominant American tradition of institutional description. Their presence enriched American social science and pushed it towards more rigorous empirical methods. Second, the post-war period saw a massive expansion of research funding in the United States, much of it from private foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation, and from newly established government research agencies. This funding made possible the large-scale survey research projects sampling thousands of respondents across the country that became the hallmark of behavioral approach or behavioralist political science. Third, the development of statistical methods and computing technology, particularly from the 1950s onwards, made it possible to collect, store, and analyze large data sets in ways that had previously been impossible. The behavioral approach reached its full institutional expression in political science during the 1950s, often described as the decade of behavioral revolution. Charles Merriam of the University of Chicago, sometimes considered a pioneer of the behavioral approach, had been arguing since the 1920s that political science needed to become more scientific. But it was in the 1950s and 60s that the behavioralist program was most fully developed and most widely accepted. In 1953, David Easton published The Political System, which became one of the most influential texts of the behavioral revolution. Easton argued that political science lacked a systematic theoretical framework, that it collected facts without organizing them into a coherent body of theory. He called for the development of a general theory of politics that would be genuinely scientific, capable of explaining political phenomena across different contexts and time periods. The behavioralist movement was also powerfully shaped by the development of the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan, founded in 1946. The Michigan Center pioneered the use of use of large national probability samples for the study of voting behaviors and political attitudes. Its landmark study, The American Voters, published in 1960 by Angus Campbell, Philip Converse, and Warren Miller and Donald Stokes, became the defining work. David Easton is the most important theoretical architect of the behavioral approach in political science, both in Canada in 1917 and born in Canada in 1917 and dying in 2014. Easton spent most of his academic career at the University of Chicago and the University of California, and his work defined the intellectual agenda of behavioralism more comprehensively than that of any other single scholar. Easton's primary contribution was the development of systems analysis as the theoretical framework for behavioral political science. In his systems framework, the political system is conceived as a mechanism that converts inputs from the environment, demands from citizens and groups, and support for political institutions into authoritative outputs in the form of decisions and policies. These outputs are feedbacks into the environment, producing new demands and new support or opposition. This system framework provided behavioralism with the theoretical architecture it needed to transform the collection of empirical data into genuine scientific knowledge. It gave researcher a model of how the political system worked, a model that could be tested against data and refined through research. The framework was explicitly designed to be general, applicable to any political system at any time and in any country, giving it the universalist ambition that is characteristic of scientific theory. Gabriel Almond is a second major figure associated with the behavioral approach, particularly in the areas of comparative politics and political culture. Almond was one of the most creative and productive comparative political scientists of the 20th century, and his contribution ranged from the study of political system and political culture to development theory and interest group politics. Almond's most influential work was done in collaboration with Sidney Verba in The Civic Culture, published in 1963. The study surveyed political attitudes and democratic orientations in 5 countries, United States, UK, Germany, Italy, and Mexico, and used the resulting data to argue that democratic stability dependent not only on formal institutions, institutional arrangements, but also on a specific political culture that combined civic participation with the deference to authority. Almond also developed a framework for the comparative study of political systems in collaboration with James Coleman and later with Bingham Paul. This framework presented in the Politics of the Developing Areas, published in 1960, and developed further in subsequent works, used concepts drawn from structural functionalism, a theoretical tradition in sociology, to identify the function that all political systems must perform and to compare how different political systems perform them. Robert Dahl is the third major figure of the behavioral approach who deserves close study. Born in 1915 and dying in 2014, Dahl was one of the most influential political scientists of the 20th century, a political theorist who combined rigorous empirical analysis with the sustained engagements with normative questions about democracy, power, and political equality. Dahl's most important empirical work was his study of political power in New Haven, Connecticut, published as Who Governs in 1961. This study investigated who actually makes political decisions in a democratic city, whether power is concentrated in the hands of a small elite or distributed more broadly across multiple competing groups, using a sophisticated research design that involved tracing the actual making of decisions in three policy areas over a historical period. Dahl concluded that power in New Haven was fragmented and pluralistic rather than concentrated. This finding gave rise to what Dahl called the theory of polyarchy, a concept introduced in his 1956 work, a preface to democratic theory. Polyarchy for Dahl described actually existing democracies, political systems characterized by competitive elections, universal suffrage, freedom of speech and association, and multiple competing centers of political power. The behavioral approach was enormously, important for the development of political science as an academic discipline. Its most fundamental contribution was to make political science genuinely scientific in the modern areas, to transform it from a discipline focused on description and normative arguments to one that built knowledge through systematic empirical research, hypothesis testing, and the development of general explanatory theories. It had several important consequences. First, it dramatically increased the reliability of political knowledge. Claims about political behavior could no longer be made on the basis of intuition, anecdotes, or ideological assertion. They had to be grounded in systematic evidence. Second, it made political science cumulative. Each study built on the result of previous studies, gradually deepening our understandings of specific political phenomena through an accumulating body of verified knowledge. Thirdly, the behavioral approach opened political science to productive collaboration with other social sciences by adopting shared methods, surveys, statistical analysis, experimental design. Behavioralists made political science compatible with sociology, psychology, and economics in ways that enriched all these disciplines. Fourth, behavioralism generated enormously important empirical findings about political life. Our understanding of voting behavior, party system, political attitudes, interest groups, legislative behavior, and bureaucratic politics was all transformed by behavioralist research. Despite its achievements, there are important criticisms related to this. The most important of these is that behavioralism had sacrificed relevance for rigor than its zeal to make political science scientific. It had disconnected the discipline from the most pressing problems of political life. 60s was a decade of profound political crisis in the United States and across the world. Civil rights struggles, urban poverty, the Vietnam War, students' rebellion, assassination of political leaders. These were urgent political problems that demanded urgent political analysis. Critics argued that behavioralist political science, with its focus on statistical analysis of surveys and its commitment to value neutrality, had nothing useful to say about these pressing political realities. The second major criticism was that behavioralism had neglected values, than in its commitment to objective, value-neutral research. It had excluded from political science precisely the normative questions about justice, rights, and the good society that are most important for political life, or political science that could describe and explain voting patterns with great precision, but could say nothing about whether political arrangements were just or unjust. Limitations of behavioralism gave rise to the post-behavioral approach, a movement of criticism and a reform within political science that sought to correct the excesses of behavioral revolution without abandoning its scientific achievements. Post-behavioral approach emerged from the late 60s onwards, stimulated by the political crisis of the decade and by intellectual dissatisfaction with the narrowness of behavioralist research. The term post-behavioralism was given its most authoritative statement by David Easton in his presidential address to the American Political Science Association in 1969. This was a remarkable intellectual movement, the leading architect of the behavioral revolution announcing that the revolution had gone too far and needed correction. Easton argued that behavioralism had produced a retreat into methodology, a situation in which political scientists had become increasingly sophisticated in their research techniques while becoming decreasingly relevant to the actual political problems of their time. Easton's post-behavioral credo had two central elements. First was relevance, the insistence that political science must engage with the pressing political problems of the day and must produce knowledge that can be used to address these problems. The second was action, the insistence that political scientists have a professional and intellectual responsibility, not merely to study political life, but to contribute to its improvement. The post-behavioral approach is characterized by several features. The first and foremost is its emphasis on relevance, on ensuring that political research addresses questions that matter for the lives of real people in real political communities. The relevance criteria does not mean that research should sacrifice rigor for accessibility. Post-behavioralists did not reject empirical methods, systematic data collection, or rigorous analysis. What they rejected was the behavioralist tendency to let methodological convenience determine the research agenda. The second feature is value orientation. This post-behavioralism rejected the behavioral ideal of complete value neutrality in political research. It argued that the choice of what to study, how to study, and what to do with the findings inevitably reflects values, and that political scientists should be explicit and reflective about the values that guide their work rather than pretending to a neutrality that is both impossible and is potentially misleading. The third is a problem-solving orientation, an emphasis on using political research to address practical problems of the day. The post-behavioral approach also emphasized the importance of creativity and innovation in political research, a reaction against what critics saw as the formulaic quality of much behavioralist research, which intended to apply the same survey methods and statistical techniques to an increasingly narrow range of questions. Post-behavioralists called for more imaginative and contextually sensitive approaches to political inquiry. One important expression of post-behavioralist value orientation was its engagement with normative traditions of political philosophy. Post-behavioralists reopened the connection between empirical political science and normative political theory that behavioralism had sought to sever. This reconnection was not a retreat to the old normative tradition, but rather an effort to integrate the two. Interpretive methods, including the study of political discourse, the analysis of political narratives, and the interpretation of political culture, also received increased attention in the post-behavioral period. Political scientists began to recognize that understanding political life required not only counting and measuring political behaviors, but also interpreting the meanings that political actors attach to their actions and to the political world around them. Comparing the two approaches helps us clarify what each contributed and how they differ. The most fundamental difference is in their orientation towards values and facts. Behavioralism aspired to be value free. This value neutrality was modeled on the natural sciences, where the personal values of researchers are not supposed to influence their experimental method. Post-behavioralism argued that this ideal was both impossible and potentially dangerous. Impossible because all choices in research, what to study, how to measure, and how to interpret findings, inevitably reflect values, and dangerous because the pretense of value neutrality could make the conservative political implications of accepting existing political arrangements as the baseline for research. The second difference is in their priority between science and relevance. Behavioralism prioritized scientific rigor, the development of reliable, verified knowledge about political behavior, and treated relevance as secondary. Post-behavioralism insisted that relevance must be primary, that a politically relevant political science, however scientifically rigorous, has failed in its fundamental purposes. The third difference is methodological. Behavioralism strongly favored quantitative methods, surveys, statistical analysis, and formal modeling. The post-behavioral approach has made several important contributions to political science. The first is its insistence that political science must remain engaged with the political problems of its time. This engagement has kept the discipline connected to the urgent questions of democratic politics, questions about rights, justice, inequality, representation, and the quality of governance that purely scientific research might otherwise neglect. Second contribution is the restoration of normative political theory as a legitimate and important component of political science. The post-behavioral period saw a renaissance of political philosophy, stimulated in part by the publication of John Rawls' A Theory of Justice in 1971. This masterwork of normative political philosophy demonstrated that careful philosophical reasoning about justice could be both intellectually rigorous and practically relevant, combining the virtues of both the normative and empirical traditions. The third contribution is the enrichment of political sciences methodological repertoire. The post-behavioral embrace of methodological pluralism has made political science better equipped to study the full range of important political phenomena, from individual voting behavior to historical political change, from institutional design to political culture, from electoral competition to social movement and political violence. Both the approaches are equally relevant to contemporary political science and to the practical challenges of governance and democracy in the 21st century in terms of policy making and governance. Both approaches contribute essential but different elements. While behavioral contributes to the tools for evidence-based governance, the ability to measure public opinion, evaluate the effects of policies, study the behavior of bureaucratic and legislator, and assess the performance of governmental institutions through systematic collection and analysis. In the use of randomized controlled trials to assess the impact of government programs, pioneered by researchers associated with Poverty Action Lab, represents behavioralism's most distinctive or most direct contribution to evidence-based governance. The post-behavioral approach contributes the ethical framework and normative standards that govern the use of this evidence. It insists that evidence-based governance must be governed by values, commitments to justice, equality, rights, and human dignity, and not merely by calculation of efficiency. The contemporary relevance of both the approaches extends beyond the governance to a wide range of social and political issues that are defining challenges of the 21st century. The study of democratic participation and representation is one area where both approaches are actively engaged. Behavioral research on voting patterns, party identification, political attitudes, and electoral participation continues to produce important findings. The We have now completed the lecture 14 on the behavioral and post-behavioral approach in political science. Let us bring together the key ideas. We began by linking today's lecture to lecture 13, where we compared the normative and empirical methods. We saw that the behavioral approach represents the fullest development of the empirical commitment within the political science, its most rigorous and systematic expression. Post-behavioral approach then emerged as a corrective, restoring the discipline connection to values and social relevance without abandoning the scientific gains of behavioralism. We defined the behavioral approach as the orientation that makes observable political behavior the primary object of political inquiry through data collection, hypothesis testing, quantitative analysis, etc. We examined its 5 key features: commitment to the scientific method, use of quantitative data, objectivity, interdisciplinary character, and focus on explanation. We traced its historical development from Charles Merriam's early advocacy through the post-war behavioral revolution of the 1950s. We studied 3 key thinkers: David Easton, his systems framework; Gabriel Almond, his comparative functionalism; and Robert Dell and his theory of polyarchy. Thank you.